Hi everybody, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to do our second show where I answer viewer questions. So I got through, I think, the first 15 or 16 or so questions in the last time I did this. It wasn't the last show, but the last time I did it. And this time I hope to get through the rest that have been asked so far. So let's go ahead and start here. First question comes from Chess Monkey, and he says this. I'm rated about 1800 USCF. What's the best way to learn a new opening? For example, should I study a variation a week, or two or three or more weeks in depth? Study all variations superficially at first, and then go back in more detail. So that's the first part. And the second part is about keeping fresh about the openings you already know. It says, for example, I play the King's Indian Defense, and although I encounter the main lines once in a while, it's not that frequent. And some sidelines which are very sharp, like the 4 pawns, only come up maybe twice a year, but one slip can be fatal. Okay, so how do we learn a new opening, and what do you do to review them? There are a number of ways you can try to learn a new opening. I mean, one thing that I would suggest, I'd suggest maybe a couple of different ideas here. One is that you just play it. Just have some fun, play it in Blitz, see what happens, and then kind of learn from your mistakes. But a more rigorous way to do it would be something like this. So I would say find some player who plays the lines that you like, and make a database of their games and go through them, see what they do, and from that, kind of by osmosis, as it were, you get to learn what some of the main lines look like, the patterns that are common to those lines, the main plans, and so on. And then from there, I would say, if you've got a book on that opening, just go through the main lines. Nothing really super specific. You don't have to memorize everything. And anyway, so with those two bits of information behind you, or those two, let's say, introductory procedures behind you, then start to play it in Blitz and just see how it goes. And from there, as you make mistakes, as things go wrong, then learn the fine points. But I would say that the key thing is just to get a good general sense of what the main development plans and then strategic ideas those variations are, and you can get that again by creating a database of games played by strong players, or the strongest players in that opening or within sub variations. But anyway, I would say go at it from that route. So start generally, and then taper into the or let's say fine grain into the more specific information as you get some experience and as you see problems arising from your own Blitz games. Okay, and then about maintaining what you know, I would just say periodically review it. I mean, there's not really anything more to it than that. If you're playing Blitz regularly, not that you should make Blitz by any means your first and main source of study, but some Blitz from time to time, especially to keep sharp on what's happening in your openings, is a very good idea. So I think if you're reviewing the openings from your Blitz games, that doesn't take very long. You could spend maybe 5-10 minutes at the end of the day, maybe a little bit longer if necessary, just making sure that you played it right, play the opening right. So I think if you're doing that and you're playing Blitz on a fairly regular basis, that'll probably keep you sharp. I mean, you'll see, for example, the 4 pawns attack more than twice a year if you're playing Blitz. So I would just suggest that. But you can also, you should have little database files with your opening repertoire worked out, kind of like your own personal ECO or MCO, and review that before a tournament. Okay, next question from from Sengi, I think, and he asks, what do you think is better, a tactical style or a positional style? I'm inclined to think that there's really I'm not sure that there, first of all, is any such thing as a tactical style or a positional style, because you just can't play chess without both legs. I mean, if you had a computer that could calculate, let's say, 6-7 moves perfectly, but had no positional understanding whatsoever, it wouldn't be too hard to beat it. I mean, it would play moves like H4, A4, as regularly as it plays moves in the center of the board. So, there's just really no way of getting around being able to play to some extent both positionally and tactically. I mean, it's just the way the game works. Now, if you mean a style whereby you're going for especially complicated positions versus one where it's a bit calmer. Well, I would just say it's there again. There isn't a better style, but rather what you should do first of all is I wouldn't say you should try to cultivate any style at all. I think the way style works is that it comes from who you are. It's not something that you kind of put on like clothing. So just given your own tastes, your own understanding, you're naturally going to play a certain way, and I don't think there's any reason to avoid that. But you shouldn't, let's say, try to create a style. I mean, you just play how you play. Now, what you should try to do is figure out what your style is, and then tailor your openings based on that. So, you may admire a player like Mikhail Tal or Kasparov or Topalov, but it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to have the ability to play the kinds of positions that they play as well as you can play other kinds of positions. So I don't mean that you can play them as well as those guys do, but I mean you might admire it, but you might really flounder when you're in those kinds of unclear positions. And if so, then you should structure your opening repertoire to avoid that kind of position. It doesn't mean you shouldn't work on playing complicated positions, or let's say if your style is the other way, if you really seem to do better in complications than you do in quiet positions, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to learn anything at all about more quiet, strategic types of positions. You certainly should. But as a rule, I mean, you should always aim to maximize your strengths rather than to try to do everything in chess or to play like your favorite player if that's not where your gifts lie. So that's my advice there. Okay, next question from Spatry or Spatry. My question is about how to think during a chess game. I realize that there may be no universal best way. Each person may have his or her own best way. But can you suggest one way that I can use to structure my thinking during a game? For example, let's suppose that my opponent has just made a move. Is there a sequence of steps I can go through at every move? Do you check tactics first, or check potential threats? Then go back to my plan and see if it's still good in light of the opponent's move. I've been trying to use the following sequence. Check tactics first, for myself as well as my opponent, king safety, and then pawn structure. What do you think? Well, honestly, I think it depends on your strength. If you're a player who is relatively inexperienced tactically, if you remember the last show, I kind of suggested there were maybe 3 broad stages in a player's tactical career. So the first is where you get over the point where you're hanging things, and then the second stage is where you're developing what I called, I think, fundamental tactical competence. Something where, okay, if there's a basic skewer combination or a back rank or a pin, fork, any of these kind of standard tactical elements that you see in most combination books, if you're still working through that, then I would say, yeah, it's reasonable to kind of explicitly ask if there are various tactics present in a position. But otherwise, I would say not really. I think, generally speaking, you'll have a sense, once you've reached that stage, of whether there should be something tactical, and if you have that sense, then by all means look, but you'll kind of know to look. One thing that I think you certainly should do, absolutely, is to ask yourself, what's the point of my opponent's move? I mean, unless it was something obvious and you had already expected, that's almost invariably a good thing to do. To just try to figure out what is my opponent up to, what's the plan, and and then decide, do I want to try to prevent this? Do I need to worry about it, or should I just get on with what I was doing? So, at any rate, I would say how you approach this depends on how strong you are, what kind of player you are, what kind of position it is. But as a general rule, to ask yourself what your opponent is up to, I think, is a very good way to proceed. And it's a fundamental chess skill. This idea of prophylaxis in chess, preventing what the opponent is up to, is really an important thing. And the sooner you develop that kind of skill, the better it will be for your chess. Okay, the next question is one that I don't really understand. It's from Advance, and he says, "What is a good opening reaction what is a good opening reaction against C5 other than Sicilian?" Well, if you mean E4 C5, that just is the Sicilian. So you can't avoid the Sicilian. It just is a Sicilian at that point. So I'm possibly misunderstanding it, and you can just ask again and make it clear for next time. Okay, next question comes from Rhapsode from Paris, and here's what he says. I'll try to make this question not overly abstract. It basically concerns how to defend against kingside attacks. I'm getting much more solid positionally, but I still find myself panicking and being mated occasionally by surprise frontal kingside assaults. He says he's around 1750. More specifically, it's quite common to hear the piece of advice, don't move the pawns in front of your king during a kingside attack, as this only gives the attacker points in the defense to latch onto and then break open. But it seems in many situations that white throwing his a-pawn down the board to a4 should be met by an immediate a5. I think he means h4 and h5 maybe. Maybe not. Anyway, he says, perhaps this sometimes occurs in some older variations of the dragon, defending against the Yugoslav attack. And that's what makes me think he means maybe h4 and h5. In any case, he says, my brief question is, are there any general defensive principles to keep in mind here, or does it just vary too much according to the position? If there aren't any generally applicable rules to defending kingside assaults, pawn assaults, could you show perhaps one or two situations of a frontal kingside assault where the defender handled the defense extremely resourcefully? Well, if the question is just about kingside assaults in general, then there's maybe one thing to say. If it's about pawn assaults, generally speaking, then maybe something else. So let's take kingside assaults in general, and I was going to show a quick game with this, although, well, in some ways it gets at what he's asking, in other ways not. So if the question is just limited to something like these h4, h5 attacks, then I probably chose a poor game here. But okay, let's address this dragon main line very briefly. I mean, we'll notice. So let me flip this around here. Okay, so we'll get to the mainline position here. And I mean, here it's just terribly unspecific. Or I should say it's all specifics, really. Okay, so here, for example, in this position, black has two fundamentally different ways of treating the position, and both are playable. Well, at least two ways. But facing a basic choice. I mean, white's idea is to play h5, of course, and pry open the h-file and go for mate. Of course, things have gotten far more sophisticated, and there's just insane amounts of tactics. But anyway, black can ignore this, and I mean, there's some super sharp lines there where he survives, although it's complicated, and white probably does maybe get a little advantage. And black can also play h5, and this slows down the attack, but of course, when white plays g4, there can be even more lines ripped apart on the king side in the long run. So, with something like the dragon, you just got to know some theory. I mean, actually a lot of theory if you're going into these mainline Yugoslav attacks. But generally speaking, I mean, you have that kind of fundamental choice. I mean, sometimes you allow h5 in some kind of fianchetto positions. Not this, obviously, but because it just loses a pawn. Sometimes you can play a move like h6. Again, not here. I'm not giving dragon advice at the moment. But against some fianchettos, you can play h6 and then meet h5 with g5 to keep lines shut. But whether you allow h5, you stop it, or and how you stop it can just vary from situation to situation. There's a variation of the English attack that Vesel and Topalov has popularized. Let me make sure I remember what I'm doing here. Yeah, and then here, h5. So Topalov has played this something like 15, 16 times with, or maybe even more than that, with, decent results. And the idea of h5 is to prevent white's standard g4, g5 idea here. Does it create a weakness? Well, it does to some extent, but it has this prophylactic purpose and succeeds in preventing g4, or at least making it very difficult. One other comment about pushing the h-pawn defensively. Notice that when the pawns are in their sort of ideal defensive formation, they guard these three squares in front of them. Can include e6 too if you want. So they control all four of these squares. Well, notice that after you push the h-pawn, all four of these squares are still controlled. So that's one kind of nice asset of pushing the h-pawn is that you're not creating any new weaknesses by doing so. The pawn itself maybe could be weak at some point, and maybe the g5 square is slightly weakened because now if white puts a piece there, there's nothing we can kick it away with. But it's not as huge a commitment as it might seem at first, pushing the h-pawn one or two squares. So, by way of general advice, I just have to say it really depends on the specifics. You shouldn't be paranoid about pushing pawns in front of your king, but it's got to be a good reason, and determining what's a sufficient reason is just something that you learn over time. Let me present a game that shows that this is it's not a dragon game and there's no h-pawn, but it does show a kind of I think cool defense against what looks like a very threatening white approach. So this was played in the National Open earlier this year, in 2008, and my opponent was Carl Hassler, who was a master, and let's have a look. Okay, so he plays this b3 setup, and when I was preparing, I saw he likes to do this a lot and to try to go for an attack. He'll often play like knight e5 and f4 and go for kind of a Nimzo-Larsen style build-up. So, okay, I played bishop to g4, bishop b2, e6, bishop b2, knight b to d7, castles. Okay, and now knight to d4. And I knew this was coming, and nevertheless, I wasn't too concerned. Now, I realized certainly that I needed to defend in this position, that he was going to try to create some kind of kingside play, but I also felt very confident about my position. Okay, so I took and castled, and now he plays f4. So this gives him control over the e5 square, more to the point perhaps. He wants to play something like rook f, well, not rook f3 right away, but g4, g5, rook f3, rook h3, queen h5, and just bludgeon me to death on the king side. And I can imagine when you're saying that you sometimes panic in the face of these attacks, that this is the kind of position that perhaps would produce that kind of panic in you. Okay, well, let's figure out what black ought to do. Now, because white has this pawn on f4, it means he's got more space on this portion of the board. So these three files here. So in the H, G, and F files, white has a space advantage. But by pushing to f4, he's weakened the e4 square. I can put a knight in there. And if he plays d3, well, that's going to weaken the e3 pawn. So that I don't necessarily mind either. Now, another thing is, okay, white's plan is not only to shove these pawns down my throat, but also to play knight to f5. So that clears the diagonal for his bishop, and it's putting the knight on an aggressive square, and he's going to kick my bishop. So everything looks pretty good here. Okay, well, again, my trumps, I've got the e file, I've got more space in the center, and I've got the e4 square unless he wants to weaken e3. So I play rook to e8. I think this is a good move, with the point that now I can drop my bishop back to f8 at leisure. So he plays knight to c3, developing. I play bishop to f8 preemptively. g4. Okay, so here he comes. And now I want to have a knight on e4. So I played knight c5, and now knight f to e4. So that way if he takes, I can take back with the knight. I could consider taking back with the pawn, but the thing is, if I take with the pawn, while I get the d3 square for my knight, I'm afraid that this knight could just turn out to be an ornament rather than a particularly useful piece. So I'm not entirely sure. I think this is a reasonable way to proceed. My pawn being on e4 also stops the rook lift. Whoops, not to f4, but to f3 and h3. So there is something to be said for this approach, but I would have probably taken with the knight and played essentially as I do in the game. So at any rate, to avoid at least this possible approach with the pawn taking the square away from the rook, he plays rook to f3. And now, once again, this might look like a kind of a panicky situation. Should I play g6 here and bishop to g7? So that'll stop queen h5, but maybe he can play, let's say, okay, if g6, rook h3, maybe he can play queen e1 h4. All right, so I thought about this, and I thought, okay, maybe I can play h5, and after g takes h6, play king h7, and block everything up, or at least try to. But I found a better approach than all of this. So in this position, made a nice, very nice, I think, move. Simply queen to d7. And this really messes him up. He can't play rook to h3 because the rook would hang. And if you were to play something like king to g2, queen to g4 check, again, just destroys the coordination here. So with this simple prophylactic move, I'm again making him take more and more time. I'm making it harder and harder for him to actually get his attack off the ground here. Okay, so he plays king to h1. And now I swap off my superfluous knight. And further, I now play c5. And notice that his knight can't get to f5 either. So that's another benefit of the move queen to d7. Okay, so now he retreats to c2. Now I play queen to f5. And so this clogs him up even more. So now there's no f5 and g6 that I have to worry about. Furthermore, I'm at least indirectly eyeing this knight on c2. So something like knight takes g5 could be a threat, followed by queen c2. And okay, my queen is just very well placed in general. All right, so he plays knight to e1, sidestepping this tactic, and he's got the idea of slowly reloading with knight to g2, knight to h4, and then the f-pawn is maybe free to go, and he can put the rook on g1 and play g6, and again, try to kill me here. All right, unfortunately, again, this takes quite a bit of time, and I get to make moves too. So I play rook a to d8, finishing my development, centralizing further. He plays knight to g2, and now I play c4. All right, so what does this do? Well, a couple of ideas here. One is that I'm perhaps getting ready to play d4 in some variations. Also, there's the idea of knight to c5, and then my knight may jump into d3. Also, again, the d4 trick is coming into play. So I'm really going to crash through in the center here faster than he's going to get anything done on the king side. And notice as well that if he plays knight to h4, knight to h4, this really just doesn't do anything because I can, again, attack the knight, and where's it going to go? It's got no place to go. It's not easily defended. I mean, if he goes to e1, then I have knight takes on d2. So this is just not getting anywhere. So he plays rook to g1 first, and now he's got the idea of playing knight to h4. Okay, well, again, no panic. I play knight to c5. And now if he plays knight to h4, among other things I can play are queen to e4 with the idea, okay, I'm first of all threatening to win the pawn here on b3, but I'm also pinning this, and I'm prepared to play d4. So again, just crashing through. Another threat might be knight to d3, hitting the bishop, and then when that's protected, to play knight takes f4, exploiting the pin along the e file. So white really isn't getting anywhere here. Plays bishop to d4. Okay, so I take, and now I take again. Little combination here. He plays bishop a7. I play rook to a8. Play bishop to b6. And now after rook to a6, we see all of a sudden that he's got a serious tactical problem. His bishop's under attack, and there's no really convenient way for him to defend it. Actually, I think queen to b5. The queen to b5, then I have queen to e4. And after bishop to c7, which is what he chose in the game, I play knight to d4, forking the queen and the rook, and of course the e-pawn is pinned. So I'm just winning material here. He took the rook, which I had seen. I play knight takes f3, attacking both his rook and the queen. He plays queen takes b7, queen to h3, so an important move, which forces him to cough up the f-pawn, so that way his bishop covers the mate, but now I just take, and then I take this, and then queen to d3, attacking the d-pawn and keeping my queen in the heart of his position, and here my opponent resigned. So this was a game I was quite happy with, and but I think it's a good illustration, again, of a very nice active defense. Notice that I followed the standard prescription that when your opponent attacks on the flank, that you counterattack in the center. It doesn't always work, but it's a good rule of thumb, and certainly one of the first things that you should look at when you're under pressure in that way. notice that I never had to push any of my pawns on the king side, and in fact never had to really make an explicitly defensive move at all over there. I was able to slow down his threats with some little tricks like queen of d7 earlier in the game, and then my own play in the center was faster than his. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I'm not sure that I was able to really specifically help you with the, let's say, the h-pawn advance, but as far as general defensive strategies go, I hope this was helpful. Okay, next question, a little diffuse. Okay, so Cornraid asks, which books, if any, would you recommend in the following categories? Okay, and then the first is just general literature revolving around chess. And one of the things he points out is, okay, Stefan Zweig's Schach novel, and yeah, I mean, Nabokov wrote about chess, it's the famous Illusion defense, but I'm not really the most apt person to ask about that. You might want to contact Edward Winter from the chess history site. We'll browse his site and maybe ask over there. The next one is chess history with a focus on history. And there I would just say, well, depending on, okay, if you mean really old history, then, I would say McFarland has published some of the best books there. There's books on Amos Byrne, and there's this gigantic volume on Alyekhin. But, for just general chess history books, Kasparov's are certainly excellent. For the chess analysis as well as a general discussion of all of the world champions. So Kasparov's My Great Predecessor series would be a pretty obvious choice. Okay. All right, let's go on to another question. This is from Kitty Got Sued. He wants to know she wants to know my all-time favorite game and my all-time favorite combination, and asking both about all players ever and my personal best. Well, for this I would say you should go hunting on my blog, which is at chessmind.powerblogs.com. I don't think I've played an all-time favorite game, but some of my favorite games I've presented over here on chess videos. So if you look at some of the games here, you'll definitely find some of my favorites. Certainly one of my favorites is my win over Udawson from the New York Masters back in 2002, I believe. I don't think I've presented that show here because I presented it on ChessBase once upon a time, but I think you can find it pretty easily on the internet if you look it up. So that would certainly rank up there. One of the fun things about it is I had black and I ended up with 3 passed pawns on the 7th rank, with 1 on the 6th rank trailing just behind it. My all-time favorite game of anyone, I really can't say. Again, if you look on the chess-based shows, I've presented hundreds of games that I really like, and I don't know that I have one particular favorite. Certainly I'm very partial to a lot of Tal's games, and okay, Tal Koblenz, one of the great Sicilian, it was a rouser. Tal had white. It was a training game he played between the two of them, and Tal famously ended up with a queen on h8 at one point, a rook on h7, and a bishop on h6. So if you look up all that, you'll find the game, and I would certainly say that's one of my favorites. And I think it was the first game that I presented for. Actually, I think I presented that with Chess FM a long, long time ago. So I think it was might have been the very first game that I ever presented in a lecture series. Okay, my all-time favorite combination, I believe I've presented that on my blog. It's from a game that I think was fake, and it's, I think, was it Kasanen and Koskinen? Yeah, let me see. I can probably set it up from memory, but I've presented this before, so let me see if I can set it up from memory here. Okay. King is here. Alright, and white has some kind of absurd position. As I said, this game is almost surely fake. I've never seen the full game. Let's see, where are the rooks? I think this is here. Not sure where white's other rook is, just offhand, so let's put some black pieces on the board. Yeah, black's king is on a8. Really, as you'll see, it's extremely suspicious in that location. What else? We've got a bishop here. We've got a knight on e3. White. Where is White's other rook? Most annoying. Okay, yeah, it's back at home, and White has a knight on b1. And I think this is everything. It's black to move. Make sure. Pretty sure this is it. Okay, so it's black to move here and win, and I'll leave it to you to figure out the solution, or if you get desperate to put it in your chess engine. Okay, next question. Can you explain the role of creativity in chess? Actually, I'll present the answer to this. Yeah, okay, I'll go ahead and present it. So, of course, you guys can pause it as long as you want. So here comes the solution. Okay, here it is. So the first move is queen takes b4 check. Bishop takes b4. And now the thing is, okay, a takes b4 would be mate if it weren't for the queen defending on this diagonal. And knight to c2 would be mate if it weren't for the rook defending the knight. Now, do we see a little intersection here? Oops. There's the intersection point on d2. So what black does at this point is plays rook to d2. And although the rook can be taken no less than 5 different ways, only one way even allows white to stay alive for one more move, and that's queen takes. Every other capture either allows a takes b4 mate or knight to c2 mate. And in fact, there's no other way to defend against one or the other mate except for queen takes d2. But now the queen is overloaded. Okay, it has to stop knight c2 mate, and it has to stop a takes b4 mate. Now, we don't play a takes b4 first, because after queen takes b4, knight c2, the rook is back in business. So we play knight to c2, because the bishop on b4 has no backup defender. Once the queen's gone, that's it. So there's my favorite combination, and it's too bad it's fake, almost surely, but it is beautiful. Okay, next question. From Veritas, can you explain the role of creativity in chess? In your experience, what is the most impressive creative play, and does creativity only concern tactics and combinations? What about positional creativity? Well, I think this is, again, too big of a question. I mean, one can write books about creative play, and in fact, people have written books about it. I would agree with your implicit comment at the end of the question, or the implicit remark that is behind the last question, which is that, yeah, creativity is demonstrated in all forms of the game, in openings, in endings, in tactics, in positional play, in planning. I mean, it's just throughout. So, I mean, really, creativity is what you do when it's not something that you just know off the top of your head. I mean, we're all forced to be creative in some way, and I mean, there's the more you know in chess, the better. But for all of us, from virtual beginner to world champion, the game is more than just the stuff that we know and that we can easily apply. And the more creative you are, obviously, the better you'll be. But how do you cultivate this? It helps to know more. I mean, let's say, it really depends on what your theory of creativity is. Some people take creativity to mean making something from nothing. I mean, in effect, that really is I think the etymology of creation, right? I mean, we say that God created, but when human beings make more human beings, it's procreation. So it's not creation in the literal sense. It's not out of nothing. There was stuff that was already there, and it turns into another person. So if you view creativity as creating something out of nothing, making something out of nothing, I should say, then it would seem to be something that you either have or you don't have. But if creativity is really more along the lines of procreation or making, then I would say the more that you know, the better off you are. because even if it's not a simple application, the more different kinds of things you know, the more ideas you can have. So, part of creativity is taking an idea from one domain and applying it to a new domain, to something fresh. And there, I would say, the benefit of knowing a lot of chess, knowing a lot of different kinds of positions, having at least some familiarity with different kinds of openings, is that ideas from one position type might be imported into a new position, and you can use it. And okay, I think I presented an example of that last time that I was answering the viewer questions, where I showed the one game that I played against the 1800 with h4, h5, h6, and the bishop went into f6 and so on. And I found a really interesting way of applying it in what in some ways was a very different kind of position, in that the blitz game with the international master. So, no, creativity is just, it's everywhere in the game. And again, it's tremendously broad, but hopefully my very sketchy ruminations on the matter might be at least give some guidance and some encouragement to know more chess rather than less chess. Okay, next question from bystanders. Can you briefly discuss the benefits of playing slow and serious chess games? Okay, and basically he says, he's got a lot of players who like to play blitz in his school club, and think that you can learn as much from chess from blitz games as from slow games. And essentially he wants to say that this is mistaken, and but can I support that? Well, I think what you learn from slow games and blitz games tends to be different, but it's clear. I think the biggest benefit that you get is from the serious hard work and from playing slower games. Absolutely. The reason is that what blitz does. So his schoolmates pointed out that grandmasters' performances in blitz games and slow games are correlated. In other words, if you're a great player in slow chess, you're going to be a great player in blitz chess. But the point is that what blitz is doing is it's more or less testing your reactions. It reflects what you do. Because you have very little time to think, so it's largely your accumulated knowledge. You're not learning in blitz. You're not even generally figuring things out. Sometimes you can, but not much of it, because, again, there's just not that much time to think. So it's largely reaction, and reactions are always based on what you already know, your current abilities. And so the value of blitz games is that it's a way of just getting you get your mind active, you're getting a little bit of practice in, and it's excellent for practicing openings and for kind of seeing what's out there. What are the popular variations? What are the little tricky lines that you got to look out for, and testing your understanding of your openings. But as a way of learning per se, it doesn't really do very much. It's not impossible to learn, but you're not going to learn very much from it. So it's you learn by having to solve problems in chess. Okay, and solving problems requires, again, really delving into a problem and getting to the bottom of it and allowing these creative ideas to emerge. And in blitz, there's much, much less of that. Not none, but it's a lot less. Okay. So next question is from McClintock 45, I believe. Okay, it says, my question may sound simple, but it requires an answer. I've been playing now for over 6 months. I've made a video of my first win on ICC. That was a surprise to me. Okay, I've got a rating of around 900. I've played with Chessmaster. I've gone through the teachings, bought some of Kasparov's great predecessors' books, have a history of chess. And he says, but I just don't get it. Okay, and then he bought Roman's Lab openings, DVDs, and other stuff, and he doesn't get it. Okay, so essentially what he wants to know is how and what to study, and how do you get better in effect? What do you do? Okay, if you're around 900, what I would say, there are a couple of things that you want to do. And the tough thing is, the older you get, it's a bit harder to progress with tactics, but not at all impossible. It's almost almost never. It's basically never too late to improve. It's a little easier when you're younger because you have better vision, better board vision. There have been studies that show, for example, that the number of objects. So if you remember Rain Man, the match, the box of matches drops, and or whatever it was, and he counts them immediately. You can see, okay, it's 127 or whatever it was. All right. None of us can do that, but kids can pick up a greater number than we can as we become adults. All right. So our ability to just in a glance see, how many there are of whatever, where everything is, it slowly but surely diminishes. But that just means that it's tougher. It doesn't mean that it's impossible. Now, and the advantage that you have as an adult is that generally you're better at abstract thinking and grasping rules than kids are. So, there's both aspects in chess. There's the particular, the concrete on the one hand, and then there's the general and the, let's say, the rule of thumb, the heuristic on the other hand. Okay, but what you need to do when you're 900, as I mentioned before with the tactics, the first thing you got to do is get to the point where you're just not dropping stuff. Okay, so for that, just elementary tactics, setting up positions. Put, let's say, a white queen in the middle of the board. Put a bunch of black pieces randomly scattered around the board, and as quickly as you can, try to figure out, okay, what pieces are under attack? What white pieces, what black pieces could the white queen capture if it's white to move? All right, and just set that up, that kind of thing up in various ways, with the rook, with the bishop, knight, pawn, different squares, different locations. Basically do things that that are intended to kind of prime your ability to see the board quickly. Do basic tactics. So there's this big book by Polgar, by the dad, not by any of the sisters. Laszlo Polgar, I think it's just called Chess, and it's like 5,334 positions and combinations. And okay, it starts off with just 1,000 mates in one. All right, so stuff like that. I mean, really simple, but that gets your mind acclimated to these basic patterns and being able to just see these tactics immediately. That's just so fundamental. There's a guy named Jeff Coakley. He's written a bunch of books, winning blank for kids, so strategy, tactics, etc. Those aren't bad either, so you might want to take a look at those. But anyway, that's the first thing. You just got to have this basic understanding, or not basic understanding, but basic vision of the simplest tactics, and then you work your way up from there. But worrying about openings and buying a whole bunch of opening DVDs is just almost pointless. It's not completely pointless, but pretty close. And the Kasparov, my great predecessor's books, are just way past what you need to be worrying about. So it's not that it's bad to look at them and to appreciate the game, and you'll see, you'll see what good play looks like, but the level of sophistication that, first of all, the games demonstrate, and more than that, that Kasparov's notes are geared for. I mean, Kasparov's notes are geared for minimally pretty strong club players, and certainly not for 900. So there's nothing wrong with being 900, but you want to get the stuff that's geared to you. So beginner type books are really where you need to be. Opening theory doesn't matter. I mean, you just need to not get checkmated in the opening really quickly, but as long as you don't fall for the form of checkmate or versions of that, and you bring your pieces towards the center, you try to put a pawn or two in the middle of the board to make sure you've gained some space, you castle your king to safety quickly. That's more or less all you need to worry about at this point. It's just developing, protecting your pieces, keeping your king safe, and learning your tactics. That's really what I would say is the most useful thing for you at this point. Okay, so I think I've gotten all the questions here, and hopefully, again, this helped. You guys will let me know if it did or not. And again, I hope to do this again at some point. And but for now, I think the next few weeks, I'm going to present some of my games from the I Am Norm tournament that I just played in Chicago this last week. And but by then, I think we'll have had a lot more questions kind of come up, and hopefully this will be helpful again in the future. So thank you very much, and have a great week.